Among clinical reports gathered by Elizabeth Kübler-Ross is an episode that begins at a U.S. university hospital in the early 1970s. The protagonist is a middle-aged woman whose identity was preserved under strict confidentiality, according to the ethical standards in force. Until then, she had led an ordinary life. She had no history of mysticism, did not participate in religious groups, and her psychiatric record registered no disorders. The case reached Kübler-Ross through formal channels of cooperation between teams that, outside the medical mainstream, were investigating reports of consciousness during vital crises. Recognized for her work with end-of-life patients and for the 5 stages of grief model, the Swiss-American doctor was already venturing with methodological prudence into the controversial terrain of experiences narrated after resuscitation. The procedure that triggered everything followed the technical standard of the period. The patient underwent planned surgery with an experienced team and general anesthesia. At a certain point, unforeseen hemorrhaging compromised hemodynamic stability. The monitors, then relatively new equipment in teaching centers, began to signal an abrupt drop in blood pressure and an irregular pulse. Classical measures were initiated: volume replacement, bleeding containment, assisted ventilation with a bag valve mask. The portable defibrillator, voluminous, demanding in preparation, was ready in case the rhythm degenerated. Officially invited by the hospital's research committee, Kübler-Ross followed the events from the adjacent room through an observation window. She did not interfere. She observed and mentally organized the sequence of events, aware that there might be material for systematic study there. When cardiac electrical activity completely disorganized, the team declared cardiorespiratory arrest. They compressed the chest at the recommended rate, ventilated with 100% oxygen, and administered adrenaline via central venous access, a practice that was gaining ground in that decade. Between pauses to check the monitor, they adjusted the strategy. The tracing went through disorganized phases until, after a few minutes, a slow but organized pattern emerged. A faint pulse reappeared. Circulation, still fragile, was sustained long enough for transfer to the intensive care unit. In the hallway, family members received the standard communication. The next 48 hours would be decisive not only for survival, but also for the neurological prognosis, given the uncertain perfusion window. The ICU environment reflected the state-of-the-art of its time: manually calibrated infusion pumps, intermittent alarms, and staff on long shifts. Serial exams and neurological vigilance completed the care. Initially, nothing suggested any exceptionality beyond the severity of the condition. What would transform this medical record into an object of lasting interest would not be the technique applied, correct and diligent, but what the patient would claim to remember from the minutes during which, according to classical physiology, there should have been no conscious experience. Days later, upon fully regaining consciousness, with no motor or language deficits, she would begin to report something that exceeded the conventional explanatory repertoire. And it is at this point, between the recalled precision and the accepted limits of cerebral function under hypoxia, that the case would definitively enter Kübler-Ross's files. 18 hours after the cardiorespiratory arrest episode, nursing records indicate patient awake, responds to stimuli, obeys simple commands. In the neurological exam, she obtained the maximum score on the Glasgow Coma Scale. No deficits, no mental confusion, no signs of cortical damage. The tomography, a technological resource still recent at the university hospital, showed no ischemic lesions. For the team, it was a remarkable recovery. For Kübler-Ross, it would be the beginning of something that transcended known physiological limits. When the patient opened her eyes, she asked for a glass of water and, still with a weak voice, began to describe what she claimed to have witnessed during the surgical procedure. She said she had seen the medical team moving urgently around her body. She mentioned the sound of metal instruments, the cold brightness of the surgical lighting, and the detail that caused astonishment, the color of the nail polish on one of the nurse's nails, visible only from above. She also reported the existence of a small stain on the ceiling of the operating room, near the main light fixture. The detail was verified afterward. The stain really existed, and it could only be observed from that elevated angle, inaccessible to the patient in a supine and anesthetized position. Kübler-Ross was called 3 days later to conduct the formal interview. In a private room, away from the bustle of the ICU, she recorded the testimony on magnetic tape. She applied her characteristic method there, listening without interruptions, full attention to language, pauses, and gestures. The patient seemed lucid, articulate, with precise vocabulary and an absence of confabulation. She began by describing the instant when everything went dark. She said she felt no pain, only a sudden separation, as if I had stopped being inside myself and started observing from outside. She recounted perceiving her body motionless on the table, while hearing distant, muffled sounds as if coming from another room. This from-above perspective, reported naturally, coincided with what the medical literature of the time was beginning to register under the term out-of-body experience. Kübler-Ross maintained objectivity. She asked if the patient remembered colors, smells, and textures. The account was consistent. "Everything had its own light," the woman replied. "But it wasn't electric light. It was alive, soft, and at the same time infinite." She stated that, after observing the medical team for some time, her attention was drawn to an intense luminosity that emerged on the right. "It wasn't a blinding light. It was a calling light," she explained. She said she felt irresistibly attracted, as if led by something that emanated warmth and serenity. Kübler-Ross noted the change in the interviewee's demeanor. A calmer voice, slow breathing, a serene expression. Similar observations had already been made in other cases she was studying. The simple recollection of the experience seemed to provoke a measurable physiological alteration. The patient continued, "I was enveloped by the light, and when I realized it, I was in a different place, a space that was no longer the hospital." Throughout the interview, that other place would gain increasingly defined contours, becoming the setting that, years later, would become known in Kübler-Ross's archives as the Garden of Light. The patient described the environment with a visible effort to find adequate words. She said that, upon being completely enveloped by the light, she did not feel physical displacement, but an expansion of perception, as if I had stopped seeing with my eyes and started perceiving with everything I was. What she saw was unlike anything known. An open space with soft luminosity where each color seemed to contain other colors invisible to ordinary human vision. "It was a garden," she stated, "but not like those on Earth." Kübler-Ross, accustomed to analyzing the symbolic content of narratives from terminal patients, asked her to describe the setting with sensory precision. The woman hesitated, then replied that the ground felt alive, soft as a cloud, and yet firm underfoot. There were flowers that radiated light instead of reflecting it. "They seemed made of crystal and breath," she said, as if each petal emitted a delicate sound. The sky, if that space had one, mixed golden, silver tones and indescribable shades. None of the colors corresponded to recognizable colors in the terrestrial spectrum. As she narrated, the patient demonstrated a profound calm, a notable contrast to the recent physical trauma. "I knew that place was not a dream," she stated. "Everything was more real than anything I had ever lived while awake." Kübler-Ross registered this type of expression with special attention. The conviction of heightened reality was a common denominator in near-death experience reports, differing from the fragmented and dreamlike nature of hypoxic hallucinations. At one point, the patient said she noticed presences. They were beings of light, humanoid forms, but without definite faces. Even so, I knew who they were. Among them, she recognized her father, who had died years earlier in an accident, and her maternal grandmother. "They weren't old or young," she explained. They were them in essence, without time. Kübler-Ross asked if there was dialogue. The answer was precise. There was no speech, but I understood everything. It was direct communication, thought that became instant comprehension. These entities, according to her, radiated love, a word that, due to the limitation of language, she said did not express what she had felt. It wasn't an emotional love, it was something absolute that permeated me. One of the beings, intuitively identified as her father, transmitted a message to her. It was not yet time to stay there. You must return. There is something you need to teach about the love you felt here. The patient reported resisting. The place was too beautiful, the feeling of peace indescribable. I said I didn't want to go back, but I was enveloped by a gentle, irresistible force, and I understood that my staying there would prevent something important from happening on Earth. Kübler-Ross highlighted this part. In many of the cases she investigated, the idea of purpose associated with the return was recurrent. The account followed with remarkable internal logic, with no contradictions or signs of confusion. The patient's hands rested quietly in her lap, her gaze fixed on a distant point, as if reliving the scene. The light expanded again, she concluded, and everything that was the garden began to disappear, until only a dark tunnel remained, through which I was pulled back. For Kübler-Ross, that narrative gathered elements that were repeated with subtle variations in dozens of other testimonies: the panoramic view of the body, the conscious light, the encounter with deceased loved ones, and the message of return. The case, however, would distinguish itself by its coherence, verifiable details, and the transformation that would occur in the following weeks. The patient recounted that the instant of return was abrupt and confusing. I was in the garden, completely at peace, and suddenly I felt as if I were being sucked through a dark whirlpool. She said the physical sensation of returning was violent. Her chest burned where the doctors had applied compressions, the air felt too dense to breathe, and the weight of her physical body was overwhelming. It was like putting on heavy clothes after floating without any body. She opened her eyes and saw the tense faces of the surgical professionals. Everyone was celebrating the success of the resuscitation, but she felt, paradoxically, a silent grief. I didn't want to be back, she admitted. They were smiling, and I was crying inside. Kübler-Ross, in recording this part, observed something she called return shock, a radical contrast between the euphoria of the medical team and the existential discomfort of the returning patient. In the following days, the patient maintained clinical stability and gradually regained physical strength. However, she reported subtle changes in her perception of the environment. Sounds seemed clearer, time ran differently, and there was a constant sense of compassion for everyone around her. Nurses noted in the medical record that she appeared serene, with a distant and gentle gaze. During a new interview, Kübler-Ross asked what else she remembered about the experience. The answer came without hesitation. The love I felt there. It was something total, absolute, impossible to describe. Nothing here compares. The doctor observed physiological changes as she spoke: regular pulse, paused breathing, relaxed expression. The body reacted as if it were recalling not just a memory, but a state. The patient also revealed that, after the return, an unshakable certainty had set in. There was no longer any fear of death. Before, I thought of it with dread. Now, I know it is just a passage. There is no end. She also said that she saw life with new clarity, and that everything that previously seemed urgent to her, commitments, possessions, status, had lost meaning. What matters is what we feel and what we give to others. Kübler-Ross registered this transformation with scientific attention. In cases of near-death experience, she noted 3 recurring effects: absence of fear of death, increased empathy, and a profound redefinition of values. The patient exhibited all three. In subsequent interviews, she reported episodes of heightened sensitivity. She claimed to perceive the emotional state of people simply by being near them. "I don't read thoughts," she explained, "but I sense when someone is suffering, even if they smile." The doctor pondered whether this new perception was a psychological phenomenon derived from trauma or a genuine expansion of consciousness, a topic that still lacked scientific parameters. The case became, for Kübler-Ross, an emblematic example. The clinical body had witnessed an improbable recovery. The patient, in turn, testified to an experience that challenged the limits of physiology. Between these two poles, science and mystery, emerged a space for investigation, where death ceased to be a final frontier and became an observable passage, at least for moments, through the eyes of those who returned. In the weeks following her hospital discharge, the patient demonstrated a serenity that impressed those who met her again. Family members reported that she seemed like another person, calmer, more patient, less inclined to worry about trivial details. She avoided arguments, spoke slowly, and, above all, conveyed a tranquility difficult to describe. When Kübler-Ross interviewed her again, a few weeks later, she realized that the change was not fleeting. There was, as she recorded in her notebooks, a stable metamorphosis of perspective. The patient described feeling constant gratitude for life, but without attachment. Death is no longer an enemy. Now it's like a door. I know where it is, but I'm not in a hurry to cross. Her vocabulary had become symbolic, but always coherent. She recounted that, since the experience, she woke up every morning with the feeling of being in service of something greater. On her own initiative, she began visiting people hospitalized in the same facility, offering company to terminal patients. "I don't talk about my experience unless they ask me. I just stay present. People notice." Kübler-Ross observed that this attitude was repeated in other near-death survivors, a kind of spontaneous impulse to help without religious or doctrinal motivation. It was a shift in existential focus, from self-preservation to service. From a psychological point of view, the doctor described the phenomenon as reorganization of core values. In parallel, she sought to understand the possible physiological mechanisms. In the 1970s, researchers were beginning to investigate the role of cerebral anoxia, oxygen deprivation, in the production of vivid hallucinations. It was known that lack of oxygen could affect the temporal lobe and provoke experiences of luminosity, a sense of presence, and temporal distortions. The massive release of endorphins and neurotransmitters at the critical moment, capable of generating states of euphoria and well-being, was also discussed. Kübler-Ross examined these hypotheses rigorously. However, something troubled her. The patient not only recalled a coherent sequence of events during the cardiac arrest, but also described objective details, the nurse's nail polish, the stain on the ceiling, that had been verified. In cases of anoxia, memories tend to fragment, dissolving into confusion, not into linear narratives. Another hypothesis considered was psychological, symbolic projections created by the mind to alleviate the fear of imminent death. This explanation, although plausible, also did not entirely fit. The patient had no history of religiosity or mystical thought, nor did she demonstrate an unconscious need for transcendent consolation. Her previous life was pragmatic, focused on the everyday. Kübler-Ross then began to reflect on the anthropological dimension. Comparing the account with ancient texts, from the Tibetan Bardo Thodol to Egyptian and Kabbalistic writings, she noticed surprising parallels: the tunnel, the loving light, the encounter with familiar beings, and the message of return. The similarity between narratives separated by centuries and distinct cultures suggested, at least, a universal symbolic structure of human consciousness in the face of death. The case of the woman in the Garden of Light, due to its clarity and transformative impact, became a landmark in her notes. More than a clinical episode, It was a window into a dimension of experience that science did not yet know how to measure, but which left verifiable traces in behavior, values, and the serenity of the person who lived it. With the progression of interviews and documentation, Kübler-Ross realized that this case could not be treated in isolation. The patient's descriptions repeated patterns observed in dozens of other reports: the feeling of detachment, the passage through a conscious light, the harmonious landscape, and the return accompanied by renewed purpose. These convergences began to delineate, for the doctor, a legitimate phenomenological category: near-death experiences, NDEs. During conferences and seminars, she began to present this data, albeit with caution. She avoided metaphysical interpretations. She limited herself to showing facts, consistent reports, objective details, and lasting psychological effects. The reaction of the medical community was divided. Some saw her work as a contribution to the psychology of dying, others as a dangerous foray into mystical territory. Kübler-Ross, however, insisted that scientific investigation should include everything that was empirically observable, including what did not fit into existing models. It was in this context that she exchanged correspondence with the Canadian psychiatrist Ian Stevenson, a researcher at the University of Virginia known for studying memories of past lives in children. Stevenson applied rigorous methodology, interviews, documentary verification, consistency analysis, to explore what he called the survival of consciousness. Although their areas of study were distinct, both were moving on the same frontier, where science touches the limit of the measurable. In letters subsequently archived, Kübler-Ross mentions the case of the woman in the Garden of Light as a particularly difficult example to reduce to purely neurological explanations. Stevenson responded that reports of this type, while not proof of the continuity of consciousness, provided indications that it might not depend exclusively on cerebral integrity. Kübler-Ross, in her personal notes, wrote, "If consciousness can maintain narrative coherence when the brain is electrically silent, we are facing a challenge to materialistic ontology." She was not stating that it was life after death, but proposing that the phenomenon deserved study without prejudice, with the same criteria applied to any other field of science. Reviewing the patient's testimony, she also noticed a little discussed element: the total absence of contradictions over time. In re-interviews conducted months later, the descriptions remained identical, even in secondary details. This contrasted with the typical instability of constructed or dreamlike memories. In parallel, Kübler-Ross began a systematic collection of similar cases, observing cross-cultural patterns. Patients from different origins, different beliefs, and varying levels of education reported analogous elements. This regularity, she noted, cannot be dismissed as a coincidence. The doctor then began to formulate an intermediate hypothesis. Perhaps NDEs were manifestations of borderline states of consciousness, capable of accessing perceptive dimensions that the everyday mind does not reach. Not necessarily proof of a post-mortem reality, but authentic experiences with a measurable impact on biography and behavior. The case of the woman in the Garden of Light became a central piece in this reflection. For Kübler-Ross, it exemplified the intersection between physiology, psychology, and spirituality, a territory not yet mapped by medicine, but impossible to ignore. She would spend the following years defending that the study of death was not a morbid subject, but a key to understanding life itself. Months after her discharge, Kübler-Ross continued to follow the patient, recording her changes over time. The consultations evolved into broader conversations, where the focus shifted from the clinical event to the way of living after it. The woman spoke simply, but with a serene conviction that the doctor described as silent wisdom. She said that, since the episode, she felt guided by a kind of purpose that came not from outside, but from within. "I don't need to understand why. I just know that I must care for people who are afraid of dying," she stated. She began volunteering at a local hospice, still under outpatient follow-up. She spent hours talking to terminal patients, listening to stories, offering a calm presence. She did not preach any doctrine, nor did she mention her own experience unless asked. She limited herself to saying that death is not the end. Nurses reported that, after her visits, many patients showed a significant reduction in anxiety and accepted the final process with greater tranquility. Kübler-Ross noted, "She fulfills, without knowing it, the instruction received in the experience, to teach the love she felt there." The verb to teach, in that context, did not mean transmitting information, but embodying a way of being. The patient had become an example of a transformation that the doctor would repeatedly observe, the trauma of death replaced by the serenity of understanding. The doctor also recorded comments from family members. Her husband, initially skeptical, said she seemed to radiate a different energy, difficult to define. "She no longer reacts with anger, even when something goes wrong," he said in one of the interviews. "It's as if nothing is really serious." For Kübler-Ross, these observations had scientific value. NDEs, regardless of their origin, produced measurable effects on conduct, values, and the way one relates to the world. What began as an anecdotal phenomenon was becoming a psychological category worthy of study. In the lectures she delivered at universities and medical congresses, Kübler-Ross used the case as a paradigmatic example. She showed that the near-death experience was not just a mystical curiosity, but a transformative human event. She argued that, instead of trying to disqualify the account for not fitting into biological models, science should expand its own limits of observation. "To deny the phenomenon is to deny the data," she used to say. On a personal level, the doctor perceived in the Garden of Light case a confirmation of what she had intuited after years of working with dying patients. Death does not destroy meaning, it merely shifts it. "These experiences," she wrote, "are messages about continuity and reconciliation. Even if they don't prove the survival of consciousness, they prove the human capacity to transform fear into wisdom." The patient, in turn, maintained occasional correspondence with Kübler-Ross. The letters, kept in the doctor's files, described simple episodes: the visit to a sick person, the gratitude of a family, the sunset viewed with new delicacy. Small reports, but ones that confirmed a permanent transformation. She seemed to have fully integrated what she had lived, not as dogma, but as a silent practice of compassion. Kübler-Ross considered this post-experience dimension perhaps the most convincing element of all, because regardless of any physiological explanation, no theory could deny the observable fact. People who had crossed the threshold between life and death returned different, more human, more lucid, less fearful. And this was, for her, a scientific datum as important as any neurological exam. In the following years, Kübler-Ross consolidated the case of the woman in the Garden of Light as one of the pillars of her clinical collection on near-death experiences. At conferences, she presented excerpts from the interviews and emphasized not the supernatural aspect, but the need for medicine to listen with respect to what the patient has to say. "We are not dealing with myths," she said, "but with human data." She reaffirmed that denying the account because it cannot be measured would be an epistemological error comparable to denying pain just because it does not appear on X-rays. For her, the correct scientific posture was one of investigative humility. Observe, record, compare, and admit that human knowledge is still provisional. This attitude, which challenged the dominant materialism, was met with resistance. Many colleagues accused her of making space for mysticism. Others saw her as a pioneer of humanized medicine. Kübler-Ross accepted the criticism serenely. "Science," she responded, "only grows when it dares to ask what it does not yet know how to answer." In her later writings, she linked the Garden of Light case to a broader cultural change. She argued that since the expansion of resuscitation techniques, humanity was experiencing an unprecedented phenomenon. For the first time in history, it was possible to return from clinical death and report what had been experienced. Before, those who died did not return to tell. Now, thousands of survivors were beginning to describe remarkably similar perceptions. Ignoring this body of data would be to waste an opportunity to better understand human consciousness. Kübler-Ross did not claim to have proof of the survival of the soul, but she insisted that the phenomenon required rigorous study. She advocated for NDEs to be approached interdisciplinarily by medicine, psychology, anthropology, and philosophy, without reductionism. In her notes, she wrote, "We do not need to decide what the ultimate truth is. We just need to recognize that something real happens when biological life temporarily ceases, and that something transforms the person who lives it." The case of the woman in the Garden of Light unequivocally demonstrated that the psychological impact was profound and lasting. Years later, she remained free from the fear of death, dedicated to helping people in suffering. There was no regression, delirium, or signs of trauma. On the contrary, there was emotional stability, increased empathy, and a type of serenity difficult to produce by conventional therapeutic means. Kübler-Ross saw in this realization a lesson for modern medicine. Patient care is not limited to preserving the body, but includes recognizing the subjective dimension of experience. Suffering, pain, and death are human experiences, not just biological ones, she wrote in a lecture in 1976. For her, listening to patients who had returned was an ethical act, not just a scientific one. Listening to them meant admitting that there are experiences that challenge our explanations and yet are real to those who lived them. The role of medicine, she argued, is not to judge the content of these experiences, but to understand the effect they have on the person. The Garden of Light case, therefore, not only broadened the debate about consciousness and death, but also questioned the very way of doing science. It showed that, in the face of mystery, there are two options: close your eyes or learn to observe with humility. Kübler-Ross chose the second, and with that, opened a field of research that challenges both skeptics and believers to this day. Decades after that episode, the case of the woman in the Garden of Light continued to be mentioned in academic and spiritual circles as a milestone in the scientific documentation of near-death experiences. Kübler-Ross, until the end of her life, maintained the same balanced position, neither mysticism nor denial. For her, the account did not prove the survival of the soul, but neither could it be reduced to a product of neurological dysfunction. It was a human phenomenon that demanded study, respect, and above all, listening. In her final conferences in the 1990s, the doctor recalled the case to illustrate a profound change in the way she understood dying. She said that medicine had gained the capacity to restore the heartbeat, but still struggled to understand what it truly means to be alive. The body can be resuscitated, but consciousness, when it returns, is not always the same, she used to affirm. She observed that the advancement of medical technologies had broadened the threshold between life and death, allowing thousands of people to cross that boundary and return with vivid memories. And, although each account had personal nuances, the thematic core, light, love, absence of fear, was surprisingly consistent. Kübler-Ross saw in this not religious proof, but an anthropological clue. Perhaps consciousness, in its extreme moments, reveals universal aspects of the human condition. The file where she kept the recordings of the case remained intact until the end of her career. On the margins of the notebook that accompanied the transcriptions, she wrote by hand, "I don't know what the light is, but I know what it does to the people who see it." And that phrase, simple and direct, summarized the core of her legacy. Years later, the patient still wrote letters to Kübler-Ross. She talked about her volunteer work, about how patients died more peacefully after hearing her story, and about how fear seemed to disappear when death was discussed with honesty. "The light I saw does not belong to me," she wrote in one of the last correspondences. It belongs to all of us. Kübler-Ross quoted this phrase in lectures with a paused voice and a firm gaze. For her, the true meaning of the case was not in metaphysical speculation, but in the ethical transformation it provoked. It showed that talking about death could be, paradoxically, a way to teach about life. The impact of the case crossed borders. It inspired researchers, psychologists, and palliative care professionals. Many of the principles of the hospice movement and modern compassionate medicine were born from the same impulse that motivated Kübler-Ross to record that account. The conviction that understanding death is a condition for fully understanding humanity. When the doctor passed away in 2004, her notes on the case remained among her most cited documents. In one of them, there was a brief reflection, written in blue ink. Perhaps the Garden of Light is not a place, but a state of consciousness, a memory of what we are when fear dissolves. The woman who described it never claimed to have visited paradise. She only said that she had been to a place where everything made sense, and that she returned to love better. Kübler-Ross believed that if science learned to listen with the same respect with which this woman learned to live, perhaps the mystery of death would become less of a boundary and more of a continuity. Thus, the Garden of Light case remained a silent testimony to what lies beyond measurement, the transformative power of human experience in the face of the final limit, and the permanent invitation to look at death not as an end, but as an essential part of life itself. As the years passed, the case of the woman in the Garden of Light ceased to be merely a medical episode and became a symbol of an inflection point in the history of contemporary medicine. It uniquely united the precision of clinical records and the profundity of subjective experience. For Kübler-Ross, this balance between method and mystery represented true scientific progress. Understanding that the most valuable data are not always measurable by instruments, but rather perceptible in the effects they produce in life. In interviews during her final years, she often recalled the patient's face, not for her appearance, but for the serenity she carried. She taught me what no book ever could, that there is something in us that does not die with the body. She never claimed what this something was, and perhaps that is why her thinking has spanned decades without becoming confused with doctrines. Her courage lay in formulating questions that science feared and, at the same time, refusing easy answers. The case also contributed to changing hospital practice. Inspired by Kübler-Ross, several healthcare centers began to include spaces for listening to critically ill patients and their families. Discussions about spirituality began to be considered part of holistic care. The hospice movement, of compassionate end-of-life care, found in her one of its most lucid voices, and her influence extended far beyond the medical field. Psychologists, nurses, and researchers of human consciousness began to study NDEs not as curiosities, but as legitimate phenomena that reveal the complexity of the human being at its maximum limit. The patient, whose identity remained protected until the end, lived for many years after the experience. She continued her volunteer work, helping people overcome the fear of death. She never sought fame or recognition. In later testimonies, she stated that she did not intend to convince anyone, only to share what she had lived. "The light does not ask to be believed," she wrote. "It simply exists, and it changes everything it touches." These words, preserved in Kübler-Ross's notes, summarize the essence of the phenomenon, not to prove, but to transform. The woman who had died for 11 minutes and returned spoke with disconcerting simplicity about what she had learned, that compassion is a form of science, and love, a form of knowledge. Reflecting on her trajectory, Kübler-Ross realized that the true legacy of that case was not the answer to what happens after death, but the change it provoked in those who remained alive. Medicine, by facing finality with less fear and more empathy, became more humane. Today, more than half a century later, the Garden of Light case still inspires doctors, researchers, and ordinary people. It survives not only as a clinical record, but as a reminder that every life, upon approaching its end, reveals the same mystery that originated it. The doctor used to close her lectures with a simple phrase, which many associate with this case. Death is the mirror where life shows its true face. And, in some way, the Garden of Light continues to reflect that face, silent, compassionate, and infinitely human, reminding us that perhaps the final frontier is not a wall, but a passage illuminated by the consciousness that discovers itself to be eternal.